Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time we're starting off with a status screen display to show off the new type of rune I've equipped while grinding off camera so I could buy some items we'll be looking at later down the line. Before we get to anything else though, let's take a look at the description for that new rune I was just talking about. Impurity. One of the secret letters left by copyist Carol, student of Bergenworth. A number of Carol letters that were given the meaning of blood exist. Impurity is one of them as well, and has the particular meaning of contract. Members of this contract are blood relatives of Cainhurst, hunters of blood. They search out impurities in Deathblood for the sake of the Queen, particularly in the Deathblood of hunters. However, impurity is, at the same time, also a taboo of the Healing Church. Watch out for the executioners. So, there's a lot going on here, but what I'd like to focus on is how this description illustrates how complex and interlocking translation choices can be. It's often the case, for example, that a term decided on in one context can be less than perfect in another situation. And this can create a tension between maintaining consistency in terminology as opposed to adopting a new word or phrase to better suit the needs of a new context. And I think this description has some great examples of this. For instance, take the term cold blood. I've talked before about how I generally think this is a natural, evocative phrasing for what's literally death blood, with the added benefit of being shorter as well. One side effect, though, is that using this term makes the concept of death more abstract. So when this description talks about searching the cold blood of hunters, the implication that the hunter in question must be dead, likely killed by a Vileblood, is more at a remove. This is an issue because one of the primary goals of this item description is to convey to players important gameplay information through natural language. You see, this rune is actually part of a special subset of runes called Oath or Covenant runes. When you memorize one of them, you identify yourself as part of a faction out to gather a specific resource. In this case, you're out to collect what are officially known as blood dregs. We'll be looking at this item more closely in the next episode, but for now, know that it's a resource that can only be obtained when you have this rune memorized and you kill a hunter. But remember, the game doesn't want to state this in game terms, so instead there's a line about how this resource is found in what's literally the death blood of hunters. Changing this to cold blood thus makes the necessary leap of logic more difficult, at least in my opinion, even if in general I find that term preferable to death blood. But now that we've looked at an example that prioritized consistency, let's turn to one of differentiation. You may have noticed in my more literal version of this description that I use the term impurity quite a bit, including as the name of the rune itself. That's because I've taken to using it for the Japanese word kegare, which, as we've discussed before, has a Shinto-based association with ritual impurity. Well, in the official English, within this same item description, we can see this term being translated both as corruption and as dregs. This is because while the term being employed is the same in the Japanese, the requirements of the translation are different. Where the official English makes use of the term dregs, it's because that word is specifically designed to be a natural-sounding allusion to the blood dregs that members of this faction find upon killing hunters. These are called chi no kegare in Japanese, so talk of finding kegare, or impurity, within blood works perfectly well as a reference in the original, while that won't do in English. Meanwhile, the name of this rune doesn't need to fit that same context. Instead, there are other considerations. For example, giving it the name of corruption ties it to the line spoken when you receive it. Feel the spreading corruption burn. It also harkens back to another translation where you can ask Alfred about the corrupted Vilebloods. Perhaps more importantly, it emphasizes some connotations in English that don't necessarily come across with the word impurity. Corruption makes one think of succumbing to temptation, of the biblical story of the fall, and so instinctively fits with the idea of this oath being heretical to the church. It also brings out the vampiric associations clearly intended for these hunters of blood. On the other hand, to briefly go back to chi no kegare, what kind of an item name is corruption of blood? I don't think it even conveys the idea of a singular item representing impurity within blood, while the concept of dregs definitely does. The result is that these competing needs pull the translations in different directions. Now, this isn't to say there's nothing lost in the disassociation. A more unified approach might have you joining the Impure clan by taking the oath of Impurity to hunt for blood impurities, and in some ways that is more straightforward, though it does lose some nuance. Of course, this brings me back to the larger point. Specific gameplay needs and translation choices can often come together in complex ways, and often no matter what you do, you end up leaving something behind. Oh, and speaking of impurity, stagnation, one of the Carol letters that serve as phonetic representations of inhuman voices. This, which is said to have been found within the forbidden beast eater, was given the meaning of stagnation and became the oath of the League. Members of this contract cooperate with hunters of other worlds and find bugs upon completing the hunt. These writhe as they hide within filth, the root of human stagnation. They are to be crushed without hesitation. Now, on the whole, I think this is another fairly straightforward translation, but I specifically wanted to look at this rune now because its name fits nicely into the discussion surrounding the previous rune we looked at, including some interesting new angles to consider. First and foremost, it's important to recognize the unique situation this rune falls into compared to many of the others in the game, because it was not included in Bloodborne's initial release. This rune, and even the NPC who gave it to us, only became available with the inclusion of a downloadable patch to the game, updating it to version 1.07 on November 20th, 2015. That's almost 8 months after the game's release on March 24th of that same year. This makes it seem pretty unlikely to me that the translation team would have been able to put these two oaths side by side before deciding on a name for either. Of course, I can't say that for certain. Sometimes in gaming, developers will have an extensive plan for downloadable content set to be released later on, with a lot of the initial offerings ready to go by the time the retail version is made available. Even in that scenario, though, it's still possible that translations submitted for the planned DLC would have been made at a different time than those used for the base game. And considering that we've already seen evidence of updates to the game text throughout the development process, both before and after release, I think it's most likely that this rune was fitted into an existing set of translations for the base game, rather than considered alongside them. This is important because, as we've seen, making certain translation choices in one context can influence other decisions down the line. If the word impurity had been used for the Kegare rune, this one would need to have a different name. Or maybe the translators might have considered calling this rune dregs, because while my own literal version emphasizes the nuance of stagnation found within the Japanese word yodomi, that Japanese term can also be used to refer to the lees or dregs that collect within still liquid, in addition to the unmoving liquid itself. But to identify this oath with the term dregs might make it confusing that it's those who swear the Vileblood Oath who receive blood dregs. If all these terms were to be considered at the same time, it's possible that a different set of translations would have emerged, but by locking in one set of translation decisions ahead of time, that choice is taken away. For every bit of text that was added to the game in later patches or the Old Hunters DLC, it's important to bear this in mind. But now that we have made note of that, let's turn back now to the decision to label this rune Impurity. I've actually touched on this subject before back in episode 36 of Translationborne, where I noted that its use in Valter's Dialog brought out an obsession with cleansing. This, I think, is only furthered by the context of this League oath, where instead of going after hunters for blood dregs, members are encouraged to cooperate with fellow hunters to take down bosses so they can first find and then crush vermin. Even the lore included in the first few lines of this rune's description about how it was found within the forbidden beast eater drives this home. This oath is all about exterminating the gross, the filthy, and the beastly. In other words, I think the idea of cleansing impurity fits nicely with the mechanics of this rune, in addition to matching the tone of the dialogue we hear when we receive it. As always, though, there are aspects of this decision that leave out other concepts. For instance, the term stagnation implies that the problem with humanity is one of stillness. It pushes the idea that what humanity needs to do is to move forward, while impurity doesn't necessarily emphasize that. There's also more lore to be explored here, but overall I think there's good reason to have this be the Impurity Rune in English, even if it does make the literal rune translations confusing. Anyway, hello again, Djura. I'm here to hunt your blood.
Is it the blood, or are you just raving mad? When the frail of heart join the fray, the hunter becomes the hunted.
This, of course, is just a quick exchange, but I really appreciate the ear for natural dialogue on display here, especially in those last two lines. They get at the same underlying ideas in the Japanese that hunting is not for the faint of heart and that Djura intends to hunt us, but have a lot more personality than the literal version. There's even something of a callback to Djura's previous line, "Turn back or the hunter will face the hunt." This is arguably picking up on a similar move on the part of the Japanese, going from "Warewae ga kimi o karu daro" to "karasete morau zo," though I'm not sure how intentional that is. Anyway, now that we've pretty much finished Djura off, let's see if he has any last words.
It's you. You're the beast. Just think about what you're doing. It's utter madness.
Always warning people, aren't you, Djura? To focus on his actual lines, though, I think this is an interesting shift away from somewhat essentialist language towards a focus on our hunter's actions. Note that in the Japanese, he not only calls us a beast, he also asserts that we have gone mad. And by themselves, these statements could come across as unchangeable comments on our current state. He's not saying that we're beast-like, he's saying that we're the true beast. He's not saying we're losing it, he says we've already gone mad. But importantly, that's not all that he says. He also tells us that we had better realize the state we're in, and sooner rather than later. Incidentally, there's some ambiguity as to whether he's talking more about us being the true beast or us being mad in terms of the realization he wants us to have, but I'm not sure there's a functional difference, so I'm not going to go into that at length. What I think is really important about this line is that it shows us that he has some hope that we might be able to reverse or at least bring to an end our current problem, because otherwise, what good does our realizing our beastliness or madness do? And it's this hope Djura has for our improvement that I think is key in looking at the official translation for these lines, where the last thing Djura says isn't that we are mad, but that what we are doing is madness. This shift from the person to the act thus allows room for change, for actions that are not utter madness. It also has what I think is the powerful effect of encouraging us to change our ways by prompting us to make the realization that instead gets spelled out in the Japanese. Rather than saying, "You'd better realize that what you're doing is madness," Djura instead uses language that prompts us to think back over our course of actions and realize for ourselves the conclusion he's already drawn, which is that our actions are mad. This, I think, is much more effective in making players actually feel the implication of what's being said here, and emphasizes Djura's underlying desire that we should stop acting this way. Finally, I think it's also worth considering how this lines up with Djura's character. This is someone who has asked us not to hunt the beasts that have taken over the place out of compassion for their former humanity. In fact, he insists that they're still people, and declares that we are the real beast should we insist on killing. Given that, I think it makes some sense that even as we turn on and kill him, that he would try and change our behavior. So all things considered, I really like this shift, both for the way it puts the emphasis on our actions rather than our inherent qualities, and for the way it's able to succinctly make an appeal for us to change those actions. So, having gone over all that, as we make our way back to a strange nightmare realm, I thought we should prepare for the upcoming shift in genres. We've started seeing hints of this already, but Bloodborne is soon going to move from gothic horror to cosmic horror, and that means a new set of themes to keep in mind. This list comes from Wikipedia, so if there are more specialized or literary aspects left out, let me know, but I think it's a pretty good summary. Anyway, the first theme is anti-anthropocentrism and misanthropy in general. At this point, I think it might be a bit early to fully identify examples in Bloodborne, but we've certainly met a number of misanthropic characters. Second is a preoccupation with viscerate texture, especially slime, which it might be a bit early for slime, but we've had a lot of experience with viscera so far. Next is an antiquarian writing style, which is a bit harder to capture in a video game, and in a short story this would really come down to atmosphere. That brings us to detachment, with academic or scholarly intent compensating for social shortcomings, and that sounds like Bergenworth to me. We'll get there soon. Meanwhile, the next theme is questionable parentage and relations, which, other than our amnesia, we haven't seen too much on yet. Then there's the big one, hopelessness stemming from humanity's insignificant place in the universe. Again, we might be a bit early on this one, but we have heard several mentions of great ones. Next comes unanswered questions, with heroes rarely understanding what's happening to them, and check. That just leaves us with Sanity's fragility and vulnerability, which have entire mechanics built around them in Bloodborne. So think on those themes as we go forward, and as always, please let me know if you have any feedback. Thanks for watching, everyone.